Screen. All right. So I talked a couple of weeks ago about one of the gods of the Old Testament, Baal. I'm going to follow that up with another one. This is Molech, one of the other gods of the Old Testament. One of the more prominent false gods that the Israelites went after, and it's quite hard to imagine why anyone would follow this particular god, because the main act of worshipping Molech is to sacrifice your own children in a fire. And yet Israel and many other nations beside them did exactly that. And even though it was a long time ago and very far away, I'm sure the people back then loved and cared for their children just as much as people do now. So it raises a few questions. Firstly, what was it about this religion that people found so enticing, that it drew them away from the Lord in the first place, and that it made them do such horrible things? And it also raises the question of, does this attitude, does this same temptation exist in the modern world today? And can we avoid making the same mistakes? So first of all, having a bit of a look at the name. The name Molech is actually the Hebrew word for king. It's more of a title than an actual name. The same way that we refer to Jehovah as the Lord, Molech is referred to by its followers as the king. The word is not always used to refer to the pagan god. Sometimes it's used to refer to an actual king. For example, there's a few characters in the Bible with the name Abimelech. If you break that down, it's Ab-E-Melech. Ab is like Abba, father. E is kind of is, and Melech is king. So Ab-E-Melech, my father is the king. Or do you know who my dad is? Similarly, you've got Melchizedek. It's got Melch, or king, E-Zedek. Zedek is righteousness. So Melchizedek, the king is righteous. The Hebrew spelling of the word, there's no vowels in Hebrew, it's only consonants. So it's kind of just spelt MLK, or Mem Lamed Kaf. So it's variously pronounced as either a variation of Moloch, Molech, Melech, or Malcolm, Milcom, Malcham, something like that. So yeah, an interesting thing to note about Hebrew is that there aren't any vowels, it's just all consonants. So when you get a word like, the tetragrammaton, Yud Hey, Vav Hey, or Yahweh, there's no indication about how to pronounce it in the scripture. So people just kind of pop their own vowels in. So you get an A and an E in there, and it's Yahweh. Put an E, O, and A, and it's Yehovah or Jehovah, depending on how you want to pronounce it. In the case of Moloch, you get all these different variations. Moloch, Molech, Malik, Malcham. It makes it very, very difficult to do a Bible search on this name because there's so many different variations on it. So, in the book of Amos and Acts, it's Moloch. In Leviticus, Kings, and Jeremiah, it's Molech. In Kings, it shows up as Milcom. And the reason for this is partially ancient Hebrew censorship. So I mentioned last time, during the reign of the good King Hezekiah, when idolatry was abolished throughout the kingdom of Judah, some parts of the Bible were censored, and names like Baal were replaced with Bosheth, which means shame. And Astarte got the same treatment, and Moloch did as well in a funny way. Instead of replacing the whole name of Moloch or Malach, they took the traditional vowels from the word Boshet, the word shame, and inserted them into Molech in a way to kind of make it rhyme with the word Boshet. It's like deliberately mispronouncing someone's name to try and make a point. For example, if I was really keen on frogs, you might call me Ribbit instead of Robert. So in the same way, that they're pronouncing Malak as Molech to make it sound like shame. I also noticed while I was writing this that the vowels in my name happen to be O and E in the same way, shame. So in any case, I'll be pronouncing the name as Molech for the rest of this presentation to keep that point. So who was Molech? He wasn't worshipped as a god of a particular domain, like the sun god or the storm god or anything like that. It's just a general kind of god of everything. Typically depicted in sculptures and altars as a bull-headed man with arms outstretched to, receive the offerings. Um, in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 5, it refers to Molech as the abomination of the Ammonites. Not that sort of Ammonite, this kind of Ammonite. The Ammonites were descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. The Ammonites and the Moabites were both descendants of him. And they lived just over the Jordan River from Israel. So they had a common ancestry. They were all Hebrew people. They shared a language. They shared some aspects of their culture. And being quite close together, there was, trade and travel between them. And so culture passed between the two different nations. And the Ammonite god of Molech sort of infiltrated into Israel over time. Now, Molech was most famously worshipped in rituals of child sacrifice. These enormous hollow brass bull-headed altars were built, and a huge fire was lit up inside them. And the arms were usually sloped so that a child placed on it would roll down into the fire. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote in his book, The Superstitions, an account of this. He said that the people doing the offering offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people and cut their throats as if they were lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without a tear or moan, and if she should utter a single moan or let fall a single tear, she had to forfeit the money, and her child was sacrificed nonetheless. And the whole area in front of the statue was filled with the loud noise of flutes and drums, so that the cries of wailing couldn't be heard by everyone else. Pretty horrible kind of place. And you can imagine just an enormous amount of noise happening all the time. So Moloch may have originated in Ammon, or possibly even earlier in the city of as a kind of primitive fire worship. But it was eventually picked up by the Phoenicians in Tyre. I think I've got a laser pointer here I can use. Yep, over there, city of Tyre. So it started in Ammon, moved up to Tyre, where the Phoenicians were, and the Phoenicians spread out all over the Mediterranean and established a city called Carthage over here, which eventually ruled this whole area. It was quite a large empire to rival even Rome. And in the ruins of Carthage in North Africa, it was found to have a sacrificial crematorium containing about 20,000 urns with the remains of small children in it that had been sacrificed in this way. The records say that the Carthaginian nobles would buy children from the poorer folk to sacrifice to Moloch in order to spare their own children. But there was a particular incident when a Greek king, Agathocles of Syracuse, came to attack Carthage in about 312 BC, and the nobles thought that Molech was angry with them for being dishonest in their sacrifices, so they went and sacrificed 300 of their own noble children. And then the city was sacked and burned down anyway. So pretty horrible stuff. God doesn't want child sacrifice, never wanted it. It's specifically mentioned in the law, in Leviticus 18:21. He says, "Thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God, I am the Lord." It's really one of those rules that should go without saying. Don't burn your children in a fire. But, rules are always made because people were going to break them. Deuteronomy 12:29, similarly, it says, "When the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whither thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them, and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself that thou be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God. For every abomination to the Lord which he hates have they done unto their gods. For even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods." So then, given this, it's interesting that God actually asked Abraham to burn his son Isaac as a sacrifice. In Genesis 22, it says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. As a couple of verses later, they've managed to get to the top of the mountain, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him from heaven. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. So this was never about demanding the sacrifice of a child in the fire. This was about God demonstrating his mercy, showing that, a symbol that we are all doomed to die and that we all deserve to be sacrificed in this way, but God is merciful and gracious and has saved us. But perhaps some of the children of Israel didn't get the whole message. There's another story about this in the book of Judges, which actually hints at a possible story of the origin of this Molech worship amongst the Ammonites. So in Judges 11, it says, And it came to pass in the process of time that the children of Ammon made war against Israel. And it was so that when the children of Ammon made war against Israel, that the elders of Gilead went to fetch Jephthah out of the land of Tob. And they said unto Jephthah, Come and be our captain, that we may fight with the children of Ammon. So he does. Jephthah gets together an army, goes and negotiates with the Ammonites and says, they have a bit of a discussion about who the land really belongs to. And then Jephthah prepares himself for war. So in verse 30, it says, And Jephthah vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. And he smote them from Aroer even till I come to Minnith, even 20 cities, and unto the plain of the vineyards with a great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. Then in verse 34 it says, And Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him, with timbrels and with dances. And she was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass, when he saw her, that he rent his clothes, and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low, and thou art one of them that trouble me, for I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. Then just to paraphrase, it says, and he did with her according to his vow which he vowed. And it was a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days a year. Now, some people like to kind of soften this a bit and say that it was a metaphorical sacrifice, and she was actually dedicated to the Lord in service in the temple for the rest of her life. But on the other hand, you do see, like, the prophet Samuel was also dedicated to the Lord for his whole life from a very young age, and he didn't get 4 days of national mourning every year. So I really think that, that a lot of horrible things happen in the Old Testament, and I think this was a particularly bad example of bad things happening. So with this story, reading between the lines a bit, this is my personal theory on the origin of Molech. In verse 24 of the same chapter, when Jephthah is talking to the Ammonites, he makes a reference to the god of the Ammonites. And at this time, it's someone named Chemosh. It's not Molech at all. This is a different god entirely. Chemosh was the god of the Moabites. And like I mentioned earlier, the Ammonites and Moabites are both descendants of Lot. They're like Israel and Judah. They're sibling kingdoms. They're right next to each other on the map there. Get that laser pointer out again. Ammon up there, Moab down there. And they were all happily worshipping Chemosh until Jephthah came along and destroyed all the Ammonites. So the Ammonites were worshipping Chemosh, and then 20 of their cities were destroyed by Jephthah. And straight after that, Jephthah went home and sacrificed his child in the fire as thanks to his God for giving him a great victory. And it was such a scandalous, terrible event that it was known throughout the entire country of Israel. So much so, there was 4 days of mourning every year. So it's not hard to imagine that given the Ammonites and the Israelites all shared a language and a culture, that there's a fair bit of trade and movement between the different countries. And this story would have made it back to the Ammonites eventually. And so the Ammonites hear that this person who so severely conquered them, who destroyed all their cities, did so because he had power from a god who he sacrificed his child in a fire to. So then, to the Ammonites, perhaps it seems like the obvious thing to do is start worshipping the same god, try and get the same power. And so they start offering their children up in the fire as well, and it becomes their national religion. So this is pretty horrible stuff, but I wanted to emphasize it mostly so that we can really get an appreciation for this next scripture that I want to read out, which is about King Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 11, it says, Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Zidonians, and the Hittites. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, which Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. So Solomon introduced the worship of Molech to Israel, and even built a temple to Molech. We sort of appreciate that Solomon kind of went bad in his older years, but to actually build a temple to Molech and to encourage your entire country to start worshipping that is just the absolute depths of depravity. Can't do anything worse than that, really. And this is where it was. This is a photo of Jerusalem, and number 2 there, that's where the temple is, and number 1 here, that's where the temple to Molech was. So the Lord's temple and burning children sacrifices. You'd see the smoke rising from the temple of the Lord. We read about this in Jeremiah 7, verse 30. It says, For the children of Judah have done evil in my sight, saith the Lord. They have set their abomination in the house, which is called by my name, to pollute it. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. So the place Solomon set up was in this Hinnom Valley, which, like I mentioned, runs right underneath the Temple Mountain. And over time, that name, Hinnom Valley, became synonymous with hell. It just became a byword for hell. And no wonder. It was a place of screaming, of crying, of fire, smoke, and chaos and noise. Looking at the name of this place, the Valley of the Sons of Mourning is what it was called, which is Ge Ben Hinnom in Hebrew. Over time, the Ben, the sons, gets dropped, and it just becomes the Valley of Mourning, or Gehinnom. And that is transliterated into Greek later on as Gehenna, which is translated in the New Testament as hell. In Mark 9:43, for example, we see this word, when Jesus says, If thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to go into life maimed than having 2 hands to go into Gehenna, into the fire that shall never be quenched. Even today, that the name still persists. If you look at that place on Google Maps, where that valley runs, it's called Ge Ben Hinnom Street, which runs along the floor of the Valley of Hinnom, just south of the old city. So on that map there, green is the old city of Jerusalem, blue is where the temple was, and the red dashed line is Hinnom Valley. So let's take a look at hell in Google Street View. Here's what Gehenna looks like today. This is looking up towards the Temple Mount. There's some street lights and scraggly trees. There's a blue Mazda. A bit further along, there's some olive trees, there's a dry stone wall. It actually kind of reminds me of Adelaide a bit, Hell reminds me of Adelaide. Anyway, Um, it's entirely unremarkable now, but at one point, this is where it was all taking place. This valley was filled with smoke and burning, and the sounds of crying and screaming being drowned out by drums and trumpets. So it kind of brings us back to the question of why would you do that? It's the sources that I've read say that the desired outcome of these sacrifices was prosperity, success, a good harvest next year, good fortune. And you kind of get the instinct that if you pay a high price for something, then you deserve a great reward in return. You think it's fair. If I've made a big sacrifice, then I should get something worthy, something equal of value in return. And what higher price could you pay than the sacrifice of one of your own children? And like I said earlier, the biggest mistake we can make is to dismiss this as being a story that happened in a different time, a different place, a different culture. While Moloch today might not look like a bull-headed flaming statue anymore, the same temptations, the same thought processes, cultural pressures and that still exist. We still have an instinct that if we make a great sacrifice, then we deserve a great reward. Or if we want a great reward, then we need to make a great sacrifice in order to earn it. And that's not how God works. God is full of grace and full of mercy, and He gives us great gifts that we do not deserve. The gift of salvation being chief among them. And what we can learn from the cult of Moloch is I suppose, a lesson about what's sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy. A sunk cost is a price that you've paid towards something, like the mortgage on your house, or time and effort that you spent working on a project, the time you've spent working in a company and advancing your career, or the emotional price invested in friendships and relationships. The sunk cost fallacy is the belief that you have to stick with something because of the amount of time and effort that you've invested into it. It's kind of the hooks that it's got on you. It's like, I can't leave this job. I've been here for 10 years. It's a terrible job, but I've got to stick with it because otherwise it would have all been for nothing. It's one of those things that it's the reason that people get addicted to stuff like gambling. They keep sending good money after bad because it's really, really hard to admit to yourself that you've given up so much for something that's futile, for something that's worthless. It's hard to admit that you've wasted time, money, effort, energy, and all that. In the case of the cult of Moloch, people out of desperation and out of false hope pay the great price of sacrificing their children, and then they're stuck. They're waiting with a vain hope for a false god to grant their prayers, and they can't leave because leaving would mean admitting to themselves that they'd wasted the life of their child. It'd be a betrayal almost. And that's the same decision that people have to make when they come to the Lord. Now, coming to the Lord means giving up your old life, giving up the life in the world, admitting to yourself that everything you've done before that point was vanity, accepting that everything that's in the world is going to burn and that it's not going to last, and that any effort you put into it has been wasted. And that could have been a good portion of your life leading up to that. Jesus describes it in the parable of the sower and the seed as the cares of the world. Mark 4:19 says, "And the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the lust of other things entering in choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." They tie you down. They stop you from thinking about spiritual things, from thinking about the world beyond and the mission that God has for us, and instead focuses you on temporal things of the world that aren't going to last. Matthew 6:21 says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." If our treasure is in the world, then our heart will be in the world, and we'll keep on pouring everything we have into the fire of Molech, with nothing to show for it on Judgment Day. So, just to go back to that scripture in Mark 9, "If thy hand offend thee, cut it off, for it is better for thee to enter into life maimed than having two hands to go into Gehenna, into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched." Uh, every day we invest our time and effort and money into our worldly lives. We have to. It's part of living here. But as if we invest into the world, we're tying ourselves to the world more and more. So just to conclude and to leave you on a question to consider, how much does the world have a hold on you? Would you be able to give it all up when the Lord calls you to his service? Or will you be stuck with that investment, stuck worshipping Molech? I'd like to leave it there.